In the middle of the 14th century, the world of Christendom believed itself eternal, ordained by God himself. It was a grand, gilded cathedral, magnificent in its certainty. At its apex sat the Pope and the King, twin suns in a fixed universe. Below them, the nobility, the warrior class, held titles to vast lands granted by the divine right of their monarchs. And at the base, holding the entire colossal structure aloft, was the peasantry, a vast, anonymous ocean of souls, born to toil and die on the land of their masters. This was the feudal system, a pyramid of obligation built on a simple, brutal contract. The lords provided protection, the peasants provided labor. It was a system designed to be static, a perfect reflection of heaven's unchanging hierarchy. Europe was full, overpopulated to the bursting point, every scrap of arable land cultivated by a workforce that was cheap, replaceable, and utterly powerless. The foundation of the empire was not stone, but an endless supply of impoverished bodies. But from the high, gilded vaults of this cathedral, one could not see the cracks forming in that foundation. The continent was groaning under its own weight. A mini-ice age had begun, bringing torrential rains and failed harvests, spreading starvation among the tens of millions. The land itself was exhausted, pushed beyond its limits. The entire magnificent structure, the soaring cathedrals, the crusading armies, the opulent courts, rested on a dangerous assumption, that the supply of human labor was infinite. It was a world built on the principle that a human life, at the bottom of the pyramid, was worth next to nothing. This was the system's secret vulnerability, the unspoken truth hidden behind the gold leaf and the incense smoke. The whole grand edifice was a bubble, waiting for a pin. The pin was already traveling. It moved along the arteries of global trade, the very routes that brought silks and spices to the wealthy. It was a microbe, Yersinia pestis, an unseen and merciless passenger on Genoese trading ships returning from the besieged port of Caffa on the Black Sea. In October 1347, 12 of these ships docked in Messina, Sicily. The townspeople who greeted them were met with a horrifying sight. Most of the sailors were dead or dying, their bodies covered in black boils that oozed blood and pus. The authorities ordered the death ships out of the harbor, but it was too late. The reckoning had arrived. The gilded facade of the eternal order was about to be tested by a force that did not recognize kings, respect popes, or negotiate terms. The first crack in the foundation had appeared, and it was about to splinter across the entire continent. The Black Death did not creep, it galloped. From the ports of Italy, it exploded across Europe with terrifying speed, consuming everything in its path. It was a biological firestorm. This was not a war of armies, where a knight's armor or a castle's walls offered some measure of safety. This was a war against an invisible enemy that respected no hierarchy. It struck the crowded, unsanitary hovels of the poor and the drafty castles of the rich. It killed indiscriminately, taking peasant and prince, sinner and saint. Approximately half of Europe's population perished. The institutions that formed the bedrock of the medieval world proved utterly impotent. The crisis revealed their power as a hollow spectacle. The Church, the ultimate authority on life, death, and divine will, had no answers. Priests led solemn processions, chanting prayers for mercy. They rang church bells to purify the air. But the prayers went unanswered, and the bells tolled only for the dead. People watched in horror as their priests and bishops, the very men who claimed to hold the keys to heaven, died just as horribly as any commoner. The clergy's mortality rate was devastatingly high, as they were called to administer last rites to the dying, placing them at the epicenter of the contagion. This mass death of God's representatives on earth was a catastrophic blow to the Church's prestige and authority. If the Church could not protect its own, how could it protect the flock? A profound, terrifying thought began to take root: God was silent. Or perhaps, he wasn't listening. The secular lords were just as useless. Their power was rooted in the sword and the ownership of land, neither of which could stop a microbe. They locked their gates, but the plague seeped through. They fled to their country estates, but they often carried the infection with them. In their desperation, they turned to the physicians, whose knowledge was a blend of superstition and misinterpreted classical texts. Doctors prescribed treatments of crushed emeralds, arsenic, and elaborate potions, none of which worked. They advised against bathing, fearing it opened the pores to the bad air they believed carried the pestilence. Their failure was total, a public humiliation of established wisdom. Faced with the collapse of all authority, society began to fray. Some sought scapegoats, leading to horrific pogroms against Jewish communities, falsely accused of poisoning the wells. Others turned to extreme fanaticism, like the flagellants, who marched from town to town, whipping themselves in a bloody public spectacle of penance, a radical, populist movement that openly challenged the Church's monopoly on salvation. Still others abandoned all rules, indulging in a desperate hedonism, believing the end of the world was at hand. The old order, built on obedience and faith in a divinely sanctioned hierarchy, was cracking under the strain. The masters of the medieval world, the popes, the kings, the nobles, had been weighed, measured, and found wanting. Their gilded facade was crumbling, revealing that beneath the robes and armor, they were just as fragile and terrified as the lowest serf. The smell of blood was in the air, the blood of a dying world. The first wave of the plague eventually receded, leaving behind a continent of ghosts. Villages stood empty, fields lay fallow, and a stunned silence hung over a world where up to half the people were gone. For the ruling class, the nobles and landed gentry, the immediate horror of the disease gave way to a new, cold dread, economic collapse. Their wealth, their power, their very identity was tied to the land. And land without people to work it is worthless. Before the plague, Europe was drowning in labor. A lord could always find more hands, more bodies to throw at the fields for subsistence wages. Now, the fundamental equation of power had been inverted. Land was abundant, but labor was suddenly, shockingly scarce. The few peasants and artisans who had survived the apocalypse found themselves in an unimaginable position. They were no longer disposable. They were a precious resource. This was the ultimatum, delivered not by a rival king, but by the microbe itself: your world was built on cheap labor. That labor is gone. Adapt, or your entire system will disintegrate into famine and ruin. What followed was a desperate, panicked attempt by the old order to deny reality. Across Europe, governments tried to force the world back into its old shape. In England, the Parliament passed the Statute of Labourers in 1351, a draconian law that attempted to freeze wages at pre-plague levels. It forbade peasants from leaving their lords' land in search of better pay and imposed harsh punishments, including imprisonment and branding, on those who defied it. It was an act of pure magical thinking, a royal decree issued against the laws of supply and demand. And it was an absolute failure. The peasants, for the first time in centuries, had leverage. A lord who refused to pay a higher wage would find his fields deserted overnight, his crops rotting on the vine, as his workers walked to the next manor where the lord was willing to meet their price. The value of labor skyrocketed. Wages for textile workers, craftsmen, and farm laborers doubled, even tripled in some regions. This wasn't a rebellion in the traditional sense. There were no pitched battles or stormed castles. It was a quiet, relentless, economic insurgency. It was the mass defiance of an entire class that had discovered its own worth. This was the moment of truth, the humiliating deal with the devil, for the nobility. To survive, they had to surrender the very foundation of their power, the system of serfdom that bound peasants to the land. They were forced to compete for labor. They began offering not just higher wages, but freedoms. They commuted feudal labor duties into cash rents. They offered leases on land. The rigid bonds of feudalism dissolved, not in the fire of revolution, but in the cold, clear water of economic necessity. The lords had to pay the price of survival. They chose to keep their estates solvent in the short term, but in doing so, they signed the death warrant of the feudal world. They accepted the microbe's ultimatum, and in that acceptance, they sealed their own doom. The pyramid had been shattered. The world after the plague was irrevocably changed. The collapse of the feudal system was not a tragedy for all; for many, it was the dawn of a new era. The rigid, three-tiered society of those who pray, those who fight, and those who work had been broken. A new power was rising, one based not on land or lineage, but on capital. The survivors inherited the earth. With so much land available and labor so valuable, the standard of living for the common person rose dramatically. For the first time, peasants had disposable income. They could afford better food, better clothing, and to move. A great migration began from the countryside to the towns and cities, which became burgeoning centers of commerce and opportunity. This demographic shift created a new, dynamic urban middle class of merchants, artisans, and bankers. These were men whose power was not measured in acres, but in ducats and florins. Families like the Medici in Florence, who rose from rural obscurity to become the bankers of Europe, were the new nobility. Their patronage would finance the explosion of art and science that we call the Renaissance. This new concentration of wealth was the fuel for a cultural revolution. The trauma of the plague had also shifted mindsets. With death so omnipresent, there was a new focus on human life, on earthly experience, and on realism in art. The unquestioning faith in the church had been shaken, giving way to a more questioning, secular spirit that encouraged critical thinking. The vast sums of money now concentrated in the hands of merchants and bankers needed an outlet. It flowed into the commissioning of breathtaking art, the construction of magnificent buildings, and the funding of new scholarship that looked back to the glories of Greece and Rome for inspiration. Leonardo da Vinci, Michelangelo, Brunelleschi, their genius did not emerge from a vacuum. It was sponsored by the capital accumulated in the chaotic, dynamic, and brutally commercial world that the plague had inadvertently created. The gilded cathedral of the medieval age had utterly collapsed. Its facade, once shining with the certainty of divine right, lay in ruins. In its place rose not a new cathedral, but a marketplace, chaotic, competitive, and humming with the energy of individual ambition. The old hegemonies of the landed aristocracy and the universal church gave way to the new powers of the city-state, the merchant guild, and the banking house. The great irony of history is that the agent of this profound, positive transformation was not a great leader or a noble idea, but a mindless bacterium. The Renaissance was not born from a divine spark of genius. It was a line item on a balance sheet, written in the ink of an apocalypse. It was the collateral effect of a mass grave.